think I have to just submit to Tailwind at this point. Every single AI tool leans on it. Nobody's trying to force CSS and JS, and it just works for email because it's all classes. I hate it. I will never like it, but f it. We have a lot to talk about here, don't we? For those who haven't kept up, Tailwind is quickly accelerating and taking over most of the style world, but not everyone loves it. In fact, most Tailwind users didn't love it, especially when they were first getting started. I know I was slow to get started. I know I hated it when I was looking at it initially. But once it clicks, and it does a lot of things really well. I would make the argument that Tailwind is kind of the new React in the sense that for 95% of people, it makes things as good or better than whatever they were using before. But the people who are in that 5% are feeling more pain than ever because they just want and need more control. And Tailwind is not the solution that's going to give it to you. If you want custom classes, Tailwind's solution is go write CSS. If you want dynamic behaviors based on state, Tailwind's solution is swap out the class names. If you want to build a style system, Tailwind's solution is build it yourself. Tailwind is a different way of writing CSS, but it isn't an alternative to it. And there's a lot of people who have reasonable reservations. But are these reservations enough of a reason to reconsider the defaults? The same way that many devs and many projects start with React until they have a problem, does starting with Tailwind make sense? This is a great question. A lot of people are asking it, and I'm excited to dive into this discussion. But first, a quick word from our sponsor.
I think it's fair to say React revolutionized how we build web apps. When we want to build something really interactive and flexible, be it one person or a team of hundreds, React has just changed how we do that. On the front end, the whole backend side, from the database to the servers to actually getting that all to your components via an API. We tried GraphQL. It was a bit of a mess, but there's finally an actual good solution, and it's not just TRPC again. Convex is the missing half of your React app, and once you give it a shot, you're not going to want to set up your own backends anymore, because getting the database set up and architected, linking it to your servers, sending the data to the user, and making sure it stays up to date, all of that is not fun at all. And it's not like Convex is full of lock-in either. As of recently, they are fully open source, and they just put out guides to self-host it too. So if you want to roll it yourself, you can absolutely do that. But honestly, you probably won't need to bother because their pricing is super, super cheap, and the scale you can achieve with them is honestly really impressive to me. I've seen a lot of people building really cool stuff with Convex. It's not like other tools that are promising you a cloud backend where you have to go click a bunch of buttons in their UI and hope it spits out the right API. It's actual code that lives in your actual code base, like backend code where you define a schema that has data in it, or a to-do wrapper here that lets you have actions like a set complete, which is a mutation. Here we need to change the code. Try checking a to-do, nothing happens. Change this to true and try again. Now when I click a checkbox, the code just works. It's that simple to set up your backend and your frontend and link them all together. And the best part, it will always be in sync. When something changes on one end, it will change for all of the users who are currently on that page if they're getting the same data and you grabbed it from the same place. Setting this all up yourself is not fun. As someone who's been building a sync engine recently, these guys have it legit, and it's a really, really cool product. If you're tired of figuring out all the backend stuff just to make your whole application work, and you want to focus on building a great experience for your users, Convex will help you get a lot further, a lot faster, without having to worry about lock-in. Check them out today at soydev.link/convex, and make sure to tell them that Theo sent you.
Let's dive in. This ended up on my plate because of a back and forth between Tamagui, which is a component library for React and React Native, getting into some beef with Guillermo, the CEO of Vercel. We've been forcing CSS and JS for a while now, and we're a lot faster, and we're fully typed. If you don't know that, it's only because Guillermo has invested a lot in pushing that narrative so we can sell server components and TurboPack. If I didn't know as much inside baseball as I did, I would also assume that what Nate is tweeting here is satire, because it is pretty absurd. But yeah, and the threat to leak internal chat, no, CSS and JS had a lot of reasons it was bad, and server rendering is one of the many. But Guillermo wasn't investing in Tailwind to take over the world. He used it because it made sense for the things he was doing, and more people have been investigating it for those same reasons. I like how he puts it here. The entire web ecosystem is standardizing on Tailwind. That's why every AI tool leans on it, per the quoted tweet. If anything, I was personally late to it, until it clicked for me. I'm in a similar boat. Actually, I guess people think now that I was early to Tailwind. At the time, I felt very, very late to Tailwind. Very late. The entire web ecosystem is a bit of a reach, but I am regularly surprised how far Tailwind has gone. When I'm hanging out in the Elixir community, which has Phoenix, or even the Ruby community with Rails, they're all using Tailwind now. Laravel is using it now. I am surprised at how deep the adoption is in the PHP world. So many different ecosystems are adopting Tailwind to a level I never would have expected. Even the React Native Tailwind bindings that a community member was making resulted in them getting hired at Expo to work almost full-time on making the best possible Tailwind experience in React Native. The project's called Nativewind, by the way. Shout out to Gabriel for catching that for me. Even Resend makes it work with email, which is dope. Naman is a very, very useful person to have here, by the way. If y'all aren't already familiar with Naman, he's the creator of StyleX, which is, if Tailwind is React, StyleX is Solid.js. It is the result of knowing so deeply how every single thing works that you make the perfect solution, knowing that the DX can't be quite as good, in favor of making the absolute best path. And we'll be referencing that a lot throughout this because it is essential to understanding this weird beef. It's worth noting that Tailwind's success in the Laravel and Vue communities were a huge part of why it blew up. Like, to this day, Tailwind's websites and such are running on PHP on VPSs, not on Vercel, on Next.js, and serverless. They do provide some Next.js examples here and there, but the team building Tailwind and the Tailwind community as a whole is not a React thing. It works great with React, but its early success largely came from Vue and Laravel, and then eventually Elixir, Phoenix, and Rails, and all these other places. React caught on to Tailwind kind of late when you look at the whole timeline. Did you know that CSS and JS has more NPM downloads than Tailwind? That AI tools can output great Tamagui code, and Vercel spends money on Tailwind starting many years ago. They wanted old CSS and JS libs out because they're bad on RSC, and to avoid a plugin system for TurboPack too early. TurboPack didn't support Tailwind initially either, to be clear. They're not sending a whole bunch of money. Yeah, this is like borderline conspiratorial. Absurd. The replies here are also interesting. To be fair, they also just invest in web tech, and Tailwind is popular. As always, there's many reasons. We don't just appreciate the many, many times that they've put out that CSS and JS is dead, because that's completely false. Panda, StyleX, Tamagui, ParkUI, Vanilla Extract, the new generation rocks. I do agree that a lot of these new solutions are quite good. I'm iffy on Panda because I think it offers way too many options, and too many options is just as bad as too few. I don't like UI libraries for a bunch of reasons that I've described in the past. StyleX is very promising, and I could absolutely see use cases where I'd go all in on it. And Vanilla Extract is incredible for the cool shit it invented, and I fucking love Mark Duggish for creating what he created there. Guillermo hop back in, though. The very first approach to CSS that we tried was CSS and JS. Next CSS, which shipped Glamour, which was by 3.1. Sunil, another legend. Tailwind is a great default because it's performant. It composes excellently. It fixes a lot of CSS gotchas, like declaration order side effects. And it's very popular in the ecosystem. I didn't push for Tailwind, contrary to your statements. I actually came around to it. I think it's a great project, and I'm always open-minded to alternatives. I want to highlight these points here because I don't think they get enough appreciation. When you look at a code base that is writing either CSS and JS or traditional CSS, the amount of classes that exist is often quite absurd. And those classes have lines of CSS being rewritten over and over. I know when people look at an HTML page that's using Tailwind, they get really upset because they see all of these like div class equals flex, flex call, gap 4, and they're so mad that this is so much more stuff to ship in the HTML. But there's two important pieces to consider here. Point one is that the flex class in the actual CSS is one line of actual CSS that is now being reused. And instead of having to rewrite some class name, display flex over and over again in your CSS file, where this string of display : flex has to be repeated a whole bunch, you're just repeating flex, the 4 characters. It's in the HTML, not in the CSS, but that is quite beneficial for a handful of reasons. The most important one here is minification, which is particularly great, especially if you are using the Tailwind prettier sort. Because if you do flex call 1,000 times on a page, probably not doing it that much, but let's say you're doing it 100 times on a page, this set of characters, flex space flex call, occurs a whole bunch in your app. Now, when you minify it, the number of tokens it takes to minify this string is significantly shorter than it would be to minify this a significantly larger number of times. The fact that you can minify this much data that quickly, also if we did display flex direction, column, gap, think that 4 is 1 rem, right? Roughly. Cool. Doing this in multiple classes sucks. And if you were to name this properly, like flex, call, gap, 1 rem, and apply this to all the places that need it, you're reinventing a worse Tailwind. And I find this a lot, that if you're trying to optimize your CSS bundles and your HTML so they can both minify well and be performant, you end up rewriting Tailwind in a worse way. And I know so many great developers who have inadvertently reinvented a huge portion of Tailwind in pursuit of the performance wins that come with Tailwind. So know that going in. Compose as well is admittedly a bit more controversial. Naman's already said that it composes okay. The gotchas here are that in order to toggle the classes and the behaviors on a component outside of CSS things like focus, you have to swap the actual class names on the element or use CSS variables. Apparently, Tailwind v4 makes this a lot easier with variables, but at this moment in time, it kind of sucks. And that's why we have class names, CLSX, class variance authority, Tailwind merge, and all of these tools in order to make it so we can dynamically apply the right Tailwind at the right time. One of the reasons we need those things is actually one of the cool benefits of Tailwind. An example I've given a whole bunch in videos, and I don't have it available immediately, is if we have two CSS classes, we'll call them A and B. A has background color blue, and B has background color red. If I have a div with class A, B, the background of this is obviously going to be red because it comes second. But if you swap this, it's still going to be red because the order the CSS is declared takes precedence over the order the class names are applied in. These things make Tailwind quite nice, especially if you're using that sort plugin, because you're guaranteed that the order of the classes is the same as the order they appear in the CSS, which removes a whole class of bugs that I fought quite often at Twitch. Because if the CSS files loaded in different orders in dev and prod, which is very common depending on how you're doing your bundling, CSS might end up looking different and your app might behave differently in dev and prod, or depending on what order things come in, or depending on what region you're in and how the CSS gets sideloaded. Like, it's not hard to run into bugs with this that kind of suck. And Tailwind has removed that. There is one other benefit that I don't think is in this list that really should be. No more naming shit. The regularity at which you have to come up with names for things is a huge burden to engineering. There's a common joke. The two hard problems in programming are caching, naming things, and off by one errors. Great joke, but it does have important meaning here. Naming stuff constantly sucks. We've created all these weird paradigms like BEM, block element modifier, if I recall, to try and make naming these things manageable. What if you just didn't have to? It's a huge win, huge benefit. So these things have resulted in Tailwind becoming a default. And I would argue these things have resulted in Tailwind being a good default, potentially even better than vanilla CSS, because it removes a bunch of types of friction that you will likely run into if you do things yourself. Different solutions might be better in certain ways, but Tailwind is a really solid, like 90% of the way there solution for all of these things. But if you need to go harder on composition, if you need to build a really detailed component library, if you have a naming system that you're sticking to across all of your applications, if you have lint rules making sure your CSS is ordered correctly, or you have JS that's running to handle all this shit for you, you might not benefit from these things as much. And that's why some of these other solutions are really interesting, which is why we're going to talk about them. First, I want to call out Sunil's reply here because, again, Sunil created Glamour, which was one of the first big CSS and JS solutions that a lot of other things were built on top of. He replied here, "I'm extremely proud of Glamour, doubly so because Next picked it when it did. But I now use Tailwind and recommend it. It solves the social problem extremely well, and that's kind of mostly what matters when working with other people, just like components in UIs." Banger. Naman showed up, though. I see people being very divided on Tailwind. They either love it or hate it. Their view on CSS and JS is similarly divided, but generally more tempered. I don't think we've quite solved the social problem yet. Naman, you know I agree with you on almost everything. I hard disagree on this. The difference being the amount of time people have spent in the solutions. You're probably the single person I know with the most Tailwind experience that didn't end up coming around to it all the way. But that's why I'm comparing you to somebody like Ryan Carniato. Ryan Carniato is probably the single person who understands React the best and still doesn't use it because he understands it so well that all he can see is those edge cases that drive him mad, and he goes all in on his solution solid. You're building at a scale at Meta that most people have never even comprehended, and Tailwind doesn't work at that level, and all you can see is that. And then there is the haters. And from my experience, the majority of Tailwind haters are people who might become a Tailwind user and might become a Tailwind lover. They just haven't used it enough. I know that because I was a Tailwind hater. I really didn't like it until I started using it on a project someone else had spun up. And over a week or so, started liking it a little bit and then came around and ended up loving it. Where with CSS and JS, I used it for 5 years and I don't like it. I know I don't like it. And that's the difference that I think is important to consider here is that Tailwind haters can be relatively quick to transition to Tailwind lover. CSS and JS haters and skeptics, although not as strong with their opinions are formed from the fires of dealing with this shit. And a big part of why Tailwind lovers love it so much is because they started from a position of hate. I learned this position in myself from music. My favorite music is stuff that I did not initially like, but weeks, months, sometimes even years later, I came around to. And if you start from somewhere of dislike, especially somewhere of hate, which comes from something looking so wrong and unfamiliar, and then you come around to it, your emotional investment will be much stronger. Where with CSS and JS, you might start neutral, positive, neutral, negative, but the likelihood you have a strong reaction when you first see it is quite a bit lower. And then as you use it, the likelihood your strong reaction flips is also much lower. But again, I think Tailwind does a really good job of working well for people who don't care as much. You just have to get through that initial, what the fuck am I looking at moment. Also, for what it's worth, lots of agreement here between everyone. I want to push back on the narrative that Vercel has a hand in Tailwind's success. Got a metric ton of hate, despite which it's succeeding on merit. Also, apparently Sunil got death threats for glamour. I hate this space sometimes. Why are we here? And here is the tweet that gave me the title and the decision to make this video. From StyleXJS, which as far as I know is a Twitter account just run by Naman. Tailwind is often seen as the default these days, and a lot of people love it. Despite that, Next still ships with CSS modules by default, and the team has been nothing but supportive to us. Guillermo is allowed to have his own opinions. Our job is to change them. And this is what I love about Naman and their approach with StyleX. They understand that Tailwind has become, to many, especially those willing to adopt new things, the default. That doesn't mean it's perfect for everyone. That doesn't mean it doesn't have flaws. That doesn't mean everyone's already using it. It means that people who are on tech Twitter, who watch videos like this one, are leaning towards Tailwind for the next thing they build, because it's a really good starting point and a pretty solid default, the same way something like React is. It doesn't mean the other solutions are bad. It doesn't mean that the people who like Tailwind are biased. It means that it has established itself as a good enough pattern for most people most of the time. But that doesn't mean StyleX is bad or it shouldn't exist. It means that they have to work harder to meet the expectations of Tailwind users and exceed them by doing really cool shit. Guillermo replied as well here. I also like StyleX. My bias is towards, first, solutions that help CSS scale without conflicts, aka composition, which you have in spades. Absolutely. By the way, check out my StyleX videos if you haven't. Wild. And two, solutions that make devs productive and happy. Tailwind checks these two boxes for me today. A nice to have would also be three, solutions that work seamlessly in React Native. Do React Strict DOM and Nativewind meet this requirement? Not yet, but in the near future, they absolutely could. But this is all very fair points. If your goal is to have something that scales without massive issues and makes devs productive and happy, Tailwind is a really good solution. And a big part of what Tailwind has done is it's allowed people like me to not change style solutions every 6 months. Like, it's been a meme for how long that web devs are swapping what they use all the time. Tailwind has been how I've done styles since 2020. I'm 4 years in to not changing the way I do styles. There are things around Tailwind that have changed how I do. Like, I went from rolling my own stuff with CLSX to trying out Tailwind Merge and CVA to leaning on ShadCN UI. But Tailwind as the core piece has not shifted. Before Tailwind, I was playing with other things all the time. And Tailwind was the first solution that was good enough on all the different verticals that I cared about for me to stop doing this all the time. And React is somewhat similar too. There's a lot of tools around React that have swapped around a whole bunch. But React was the first time I had a solution for building UIs in the browser that solved my problems well enough that I stopped reaching for other solutions all the time. And that's what a good default is. A good default isn't a thing that solves everyone's problems perfectly. A good default is something that meets your needs well enough that you can lean on it for most things and not get bit. And CSS has some teeth, so you gotta be careful. And Tailwind is the abstraction that I have found fits the best within the component architecture model, which is how we build, without having to adopt a new paradigm entirely. I have quite enjoyed my time with Tailwind, but I also love the stuff that Stylex is doing. And if you want a healthy dose of skepticism around Tailwind, or you see what they're doing in Tailwind and don't think it's right for you, there's a very, very high chance that thinking in Stylex is going to be the thing that clicks for you. Hell, even I have some skepticism around Tailwind after reading this and talking to Naman as much as I have. One more fun call out on the Stylex side. Naman's been working on a tool to compile Tailwind to Stylex, because I think that if you like the DX, you should be able to use it and get the benefits of Stylex, because Stylex has a ton of benefits. It is really, really cool. Check out my video covering it if you haven't already. But one of the cool things it does is effectively the way React Strict DOM works, which is allowing you to use a subset of the DOM that works in both native and on the web. It lets you write your styles in a way that work everywhere universally by default, which is dope. Naman just linked the GitHub repo where he is working on Tailwind to Stylex, which kind of makes my point earlier. Again, the point of this video, Tailwind's a really good default, because if in the future Tailwind isn't optimal for your giant code base, but you were using it up until that point, Naman's putting the work in so that you can use the better solution starting from Tailwind still. So there's absolutely a future where Tailwind is still the right starting point, even if where you get to it isn't the right place, using tools like this to get you there. And since the Tailwind syntax is so consistent for the most part, this is really promising. There are some inconsistencies in the Tailwind syntax that are very interesting. In fact, Naman gave me, I think it was his 3 things that Tailwind does wrong. And if you want to see that in a video, let me know, because I am more than excited to bash Tailwind for the actual small handful of flaws that it has. But that's for another time. And until that time, peace, nerds. I love this meme. Get that out of my face, chomp. Get out of my face, chomp. And then you fall in love once you actually have some bites. Tailwind adoption. Yep.